Hi there, I'm Emily with the Gulf Council, and this is a public hearing video designed to gather your feedback on proposed Reef Amendment 58A, which considers making modifications to the other shallow water grouper complex. So the other shallow water grouper complex consists of Scamp, yellowmouth grouper, black grouper, and yellowfin grouper. And currently, all four of these species are managed with a combined annual catch limit. In 2022, a stock assessment was completed for Scamp and yellowmouth grouper. They were assessed together because they have similar life histories and because they look nearly identical until they're about 16 inches long. So the assessment updated catch advice that represents a decrease in allowable harvest for these two species. It did so because fishing mortality is too high relative to the size of the stock, and also because the new assessment transitions to the new recreational data collection program, which is the MRIP FES program. So we have new catch recommendations for Scamp and yellowmouth grouper, but the black and yellowfin grouper catch recommendations remain unchanged. And retaining this complex as a single complex with all four species could put Scamp and yellowmouth grouper at risk of overfishing, or it could unnecessarily reduce harvest limits on the species that don't need it. As a result, the Council is thinking about splitting the other water shallow grouper complex into two separate complexes. The black grouper complex, which would consist of black and yellowfin grouper, and the Scamp complex, which would consist of Scamp and yellowmouth grouper. Now, we would have to take several actions in order to accomplish this split. For the black grouper complex, we would have to establish status determination criteria, catch limits, sector allocations, and recreational accountability measures. And for the Scamp complex, we would have to establish status determination criteria, catch limits, sector allocations, a recreational annual catch target, a recreational fixed close season, and also recreational accountability measures. The Council is considering these actions in response to analysis that is consistent with the best scientific information available. They also intend to avoid future overfishing and to avoid triggering a rebuilding plan, and also to allow for the greatest possible harvest without compromising the future health of the complexes. We'll start with action 1, which looks at splitting the other shallow water grouper complex into the Scamp complex and the black grouper complex. Now, as I mentioned, this is being considered because Scamp and yellowmouth grouper would be at risk of overfishing if they remain in the other shallow water grouper complex, and also because the new Scamp complex stock assessment uses new recreational landings data from MRIP FES, whereas the black grouper complex has not been updated, and so that is still in the old currency that was used. So if we decide to separate the other shallow water grouper complex, we would have to dissolve the other shallow water grouper complex share category for the commercial individual fishing quota program. Now, shares from that other shallow water grouper complex would be distributed to the new share categories based on the current shareholdings of the other shallow water grouper complex by those participants. So if you had 1% of shallow water grouper, then you would have 1% of the Scamp complex and 1% of the black grouper complex moving forward. We have two alternatives here. The first is the no action alternative, and that would keep that other shallow water grouper complex intact. The second alternative is the Council's preferred. That would dissolve the other shallow water grouper complex and form two new complexes, the Scamp and yellowmouth grouper complex, which is called the Scamp complex, and the black and yellowfin grouper complex, which is called the black grouper complex, and then create two new IFQ share categories for the commercial fishery and distribute shares so that shareholders will receive the same percentage of each of the two new categories that they held when the other shallow water grouper complex was dissolved. There will be a share cap as well, so the number of shares that any one individual account can possess will be capped at 7.26%. So let's talk about the implications of the different alternatives. So first, the no action alternative is actually not legally viable because it's not consistent with the best scientific information available, and it could allow for yellowmouth grouper and scamp grouper to be overfished. Now, I will say that splitting the other shallow water grouper complex into two complexes is going to eliminate the commercial flexibility measures that formerly allowed Warsaw grouper and speckled hind or Kitty Mitchell to be landed under the other shallow water grouper share category. So next, if we do consider splitting this complex, which is preferred alternative 2, it will ensure that the recreational catch limits and seasons for black grouper will not be tied to management actions for the scamp complex. So I will just sort of tell you that in 2025, the Council had developed and transmitted an action to reduce the entire other shallow water grouper annual catch limit by 54.7% in order to prevent the overfishing of scamp and yellowmouth. Now, they did that while this amendment was being completed, and what that resulted in was a reduced recreational season for all 4 species and reduced allowable harvest for all 4 species, even though only scamp and yellowmouth are the ones that need to have reduced catch limits and seasons. So that framework has not actually been implemented yet, but we expect it to be implemented before the during this 2026 fishing season. So essentially, we're just trying to split out these 4 species so that one doesn't sink the other. So before we get into the next action, I'm going to quickly touch on a couple of very technical science terms. These are the definitions for what we refer to collectively as status determination criteria. And really for this, the next action, they're not super relevant, although they will be sort of talked about in that action. Once we get to talking about the scamp complex, these do become a little bit more pertinent. So first is the maximum sustainable yield, or we call it the MSY. It is the largest long-term average harvest that can be taken from a stock each year on a continuing basis, right? So that's kind of an important level of harvest. The next is something we call our maximum fishing mortality threshold, or the MFMT. Now this is a fishing rate, and it is expected to achieve that MSY that I just defined over sort of a long term. So fishing mortality above this level, this is like a threshold level, would be considered overfishing. So that's where this starts to get sort of legally important. So next is the minimum stock size threshold, the MSST. So this is a biomass level, and it is associated with the MSY. And the MSST sets the threshold such that if the biomass of the stock falls below this level, then the stock is considered to be overfished. So these two that I just defined, the MFMT and the MSST, are sort of your thresholds for whether a stock is considered overfished or experiencing overfishing. So the next is the optimum yield, and this is a level of harvest that provides the greatest overall benefit to the nation and is based on the MSY, but reduced by any relevant social or economic or ecological factors. So now that we've got those under our belt, we'll move back into the next actions. So action 2 is focused on the black grouper complex and establishing these status determination criteria and also catch limits and sector allocations. So it's important to understand that the black grouper stock itself does span both Gulf and South Atlantic jurisdictions, and harvest of black grouper is apportioned between those two councils. So the Gulf Council isn't currently considering changing the black grouper complex catch limits because changing the overfishing limit, the acceptable biological catch, would have to be something that we agree upon with the South Atlantic. However, we do need to establish status determination criteria, catch limits, and allocations for the newly created black grouper complex. The first alternative is the no action alternative, and that would not establish status determination criteria, catch limits, or sector allocations for the newly formulated black grouper complex. The second alternative is the Council's preferred, and that would establish the status determination criteria, catch limits, and allocations for the black grouper complex based on the values that were used in the generic ACL-AM amendment in 2011 and also the Council's Scientific and Statistical Committee recommendations. So let's compare alternatives here. The first alternative, the no action alternative, is not legally viable because establishing status determination criteria and catch limits for the black grouper complex is a requirement of the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act. Now, preferred alternative 2 would establish status determination criteria consistent with those that were defined for black grouper in that generic ACL-ACM amendment in 2011. And then the complex annual catch limit would be set equal to the acceptable biological catch. For preferred alternative 2, the commercial and recreational allocation of black grouper within the complex was developed in that generic ACL-AM amendment and will remain unchanged. That was based on 73% of black grouper landings attributed to the commercial sector and 27% to the recreational sector. Now for yellowfin, 80.1% of landings were attributed to the commercial sector, while 19.9% of landings were attributed to the recreational sector. So when you combine those, the allocation is 73.3% commercial, 26.7% recreational. So we'll move to Action 3, which considers recreational accountability measures for the black grouper complex. So accountability measures are supposed to prevent harvest from exceeding the annual catch limit, or if the annual catch limit is exceeded, they would mitigate any overage. For the black grouper complex, the commercial IFQ program will serve as the accountability measure for the commercial sector, but there are currently no recreational accountability measures in place for this newly created black grouper complex. So our first alternative is the no action alternative, and that would not establish recreational sector accountability measures. The second alternative, which is currently the Council's preferred alternative, would actually create a post-season recreational accountability measure, and that would be that if the black grouper and yellowfin grouper recreational annual catch limit and the black grouper complex annual catch limit are exceeded in a fishing year, then in the following year, National Marine Fisheries Service could close the recreational black grouper complex when the recreational ACL is projected to be met, unless the best scientific information available determines that that closure isn't necessary. Alternative 3 would actually do the same, except it would do this with a 3-year moving period. So in other words, the black grouper complex landings averaged over 3 years would have to exceed the average recreational ACL over 3 years and the average black grouper complex landings over 3 years. So let's compare alternatives here. So first, it's important to know that it's highly unlikely that the black grouper complex recreational ACL and complex ACL will be exceeded and that any accountability measure would be triggered at all because landings have always been well below allowable harvest limits. Next we move to Action 4, which is going to transition us to talking about the Scamp complex. Specifically, we're going to talk about maximum sustainable yield, optimal yield, and other status determination criteria for the Scamp complex. So as you know, there was an assessment of Scamp and yellowmouth. It indicated that current harvest rates are depleting the stock and we require a reduction in allowable harvest in order to avoid allowing the stock to become overfished. So we'll start by discussing the maximum sustainable yield, which, if you remember, is the largest long-term average harvest that can be taken from a stock each year on a continuing basis. So previously, Scamp and yellowmouth were managed with a maximum sustainable yield proxy that was based on the yield at 30% spawning potential ratio. The Council's Scientific and Statistical Committee has recommended, based on the recent stock assessment, that the complex is actually less productive than previously thought, and they have modified the MSY proxy to 40% spawning potential ratio. So the species do transition from female to male and are longer lived, and that is consistent with management of some of our other groupers to change from this F30% to F40% SPR for our MSY value. So our first alternative is our no action alternative that would not establish status determination criteria for the new Scamp complex. Our second alternative is preferred alternative 2, which would establish the maximum sustainable yield proxy, and other status determination criteria based on recommendations from the Council's scientific advisors. And you can see those status determination criteria that are being defined and then the values being used. So let's compare alternatives here. So first of all, no action is not a legally viable alternative. It's not consistent with the requirements of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, as we discussed when we talked about the black grouper complex. Preferred alternative 2 is consistent with the requirements of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, and it will establish a MSY, an OY, and status determination criteria for the complex that is consistent with the best scientific information available. I will tell you that preferred alternative 2 is expected to prevent overfishing of the Scamp complex, but as you'll see in the next couple actions, it's also going to have some implications on our fishing. Now we'll move to action 5, which talks about establishing catch limits and sector allocations for the Scamp complex. So first of all, creation of the new Scamp complex does require us to establish catch limits and sector allocations to allow each sector to be managed separately from one another and also to be held accountable for their portion of the harvest. Now, new catch limit recommendations for the Scamp complex do represent approximately a 58% reduction in allowable harvest from previous levels. The current commercial allocation is based on landings from 2001 to 2004, but recent recreational sector landings do represent a larger portion of landings than those that were used to establish our existing allocation. So with that in mind, we consider the following alternatives. First is our no action alternative, and that would not establish catch limits or allocations for the Scamp complex. The second alternative, which is the Council's preferred, would establish catch limits for the Scamp complex. And then the complex annual catch limit would be equal to the complex acceptable biological catch. And the complex annual catch limit would equal the combined commercial and recreational sector annual catch limits. And then we would establish allocations for the complex based on sort of these following options. Option 2 would establish the commercial and recreational allocations for Scamp and yellowmouth grouper based on those that we had already established in the generic ACL-AM amendment in 2011. The second option, which is the Council's preferred option 2B, would be to establish allocations based on the average Scamp and yellowmouth grouper landings from the time period 2012 through 2023, which excludes 2020 as the COVID year. And then option 2C would be to establish allocations based on reducing catch limits equally, percentage-wise, between the commercial and recreational sectors based on the most recent 3 years of Scamp and yellowmouth grouper landings, which is 2021 through 2023. Now you can take a look at this table and you'll see sort of what our resulting allocations are, as well as what the resulting sector annual catch limits are. Let's compare these alternatives. First, the no action alternative is not legally viable because it's inconsistent with the Magnuson-Stevens Act. Also, it fails to address the need to modify sector allocations and catch limits for the Scamp complex, consistent with the change in the recreational landing survey data units, as well as the requirements of the current IFQ program. The remaining alternatives do set catch limits based on the overfishing limit and acceptable biological catch recommendations that were made by the Council's scientific advisors and using yield projections from the most recent stock assessments. Option 2A would establish sector allocations based on the historical commercial allocation defined in the generic ACL-AM amendment, but this does not account for the change in the recreational landing data units, and it would also result in a de facto reallocation away from the recreational sector because contemporary recreational landings estimates show much higher historical recreational landings. Now, preferred option 2B uses the most recent period of historical landings and would decrease the commercial allocation while increasing the recreational allocation from our baseline apportionment. And then option 2C would establish allocations based on an equal reduction by percentage for each sector based on the most recent 3 years of landings. So So we'll move now to action 6, which considers an annual catch target buffer for the Scamp complex. So annual catch targets are harvest levels that are set below annual catch limits in order to account for management uncertainty. Now, management measures such as fishing seasons are then based on the annual catch target, and they reduce the likelihood that we will exceed the annual catch limit. So the Council is considering creating a recreational annual catch target for the Scamp complex because required reductions in allowable harvest for the Scamp complex, coupled with increased management uncertainty resulting from the creation of this new complex, is going to make it more likely that the annual catch limit will be exceeded. The first alternative is the no action alternative that would not create a recreational annual catch target for the Scamp complex. The second alternative is the Council's preferred. That would establish a recreational ACT 14% below the annual catch limit. And the third alternative would establish an ACT that is 18% below. So let's compare these alternatives. The first alternative, which is no action, would result in a higher likelihood that the annual catch limit would be exceeded and that accountability measures would be triggered. Both alternatives 2 and 3 do apply the Council's ACT control rule to calculate the buffers between the annual catch target and the recreational annual catch limit. The preferred alternative 2 assumes that Scamp and yellowmouth grouper as a single complex, whereas alternative 3 just uses Scamp as an indicator species, and that's the difference, that accounts for the difference between the two percentages. So recreational fishing season duration, the longest fishing season would be achieved under alternative 1, followed by preferred alternative 2, and then alternative 3. Moving to action 7.1, we're considering a fixed close season and recreational sector accountability measures for the Scamp complex. So in order to help avoid an overage of the newly recommended Scamp complex annual catch limits, the recreational fishing season has to be shortened appropriately to make sure that we're constraining our recreational landings. Recreational harvest of the Scamp complex is highest in the months of May and August. And Scamp harvest tends to be elevated when the recreational season for gag is open because Scamp are often caught while targeting gag. Now, additionally, in order to further ensure that overages don't occur, the Council is considering allowing National Marine Fisheries Service to close the season when the recreational annual catch target is projected to be met. So our first alternative is the no action alternative. We would open the Scamp complex January 1 through December 31st each year. Alternative 2 would establish a closed season for the recreational sector from January through May each year. So that would be a June 1 opening. And we would allow National Marine Fisheries Service to close the recreational season when the recreational annual catch target is projected to be met. Alternative 3, which is currently the Council's preferred, would establish a closed season from January through June. So that would be a July 1st opener. And we would allow National Marine Fisheries Service to close the recreational season when the recreational annual catch target is projected to be met. Let's compare these alternatives. No action would not constrain harvest to the newly recommended catch limits. Alternative 2 and preferred alternative 3 both consider fixed close recreational seasons and provide closure authority to National Marine Fisheries Service when the recreational ACT is projected to be met. Now, alternative 2 is expected to result in a season that is slightly shorter than preferred alternative 3. Alternative 2 would open June 1 with an estimated 90-day season, and alternative 3 would open July 1 with an estimated 94-day season. And finally, we get to action 7.2, which considers a payback provision for Scamp. So payback provisions are designed to mitigate annual catch limit overages if they occur. The Council is considering establishing one for the recreational sector to make sure that the stock does not become overfished. Our first alternative is the no action alternative that would not establish a recreational payback provision, and that is the Council's current preferred. The second alternative would create a payback if the recreational Scamp complex landings exceeded the Scamp complex recreational annual catch limit in a fishing year. Then in the following fishing year, National Marine Fisheries Service would reduce the recreational annual catch limit by the amount of the overage unless the best scientific information available guides them otherwise. So let's compare these alternatives. First, payback provisions do succeed in mitigating overharvest and preventing overfishing. However, they decrease the predictability of recreational season durations from year to year. Now, I will say that payback provisions can be troublesome when increases in harvest efficiency occur, or the size of fish landing increases. Now, this could possibly be happening as a result of a rebounding stock, but when stock assessments are not conducted regularly, they can't catch up with that rebound, and so we will have low annual catch limits with high catch efficiency, and that causes sort of a payback cycle that can be a problem. So, thank you for sticking with me. That was a long one. Final action on this document is expected in January of 2026. You can send us your online comments by following this link, using this QR code, or you can simply email us at golfcouncil@golfcouncil.org. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and send us your thoughts.